we're back with chapter 7. Here we go. Elizabeth stood in the doorway of the dining room, feeling stiff in Caroline's corset underneath her evening dress. Because she was several inches taller than Caroline Bingley, her shins were exposed and her slippers were too tight. She scooted into the room behind one of the footmen and followed him to an empty place setting where he held her chair for her. The moment she entered the room, both Mr. Bingley and Mr. Darcy had gotten up from their chairs and stood at attention. The former flashing a bewitching smile, the latter perfecting his smolder. Whoa. When she was seated, they returned to their chairs, and Mr. Bingley leaned over and whispered to her, "You look beautiful." "Thank you," she replied breathlessly. Her corset was now digging into her ribs, which felt as though they were on the verge of snapping in half. Across the table, her sister was smiling mysteriously at her. Next to Jane sat Mr. Darcy, whose eyes flitted between Elizabeth and Mr. Bingley. Feeling self-conscious in her too small dress that accentuated her cleavage, Elizabeth turned her attention to Caroline. She sat with her shoulders perfectly straight, an expression of apathy on her would-be pretty, if she wasn't such a conceited snob, face. When her eyes met Elizabeth's, she narrowed them, as if she believed her to be purposefully flaunting her assets in her mercifully provided gown. Elizabeth quickly glanced down at her place setting. She saw they had already been served what looked like a creamy broth. Watching Jane for cues, she picked up her soup spoon and carefully dipped it sideways into her bowl. She tried and failed to lean forward in the corset. Instead, she slowly brought the spoon up to meet her lips, praying she wouldn't spill it onto her gown in the process. She hesitantly tasted the soup and was pleasantly surprised to find it was delicious. Suddenly feeling ravenous, she mentally cursed the painfully slow progression of her spoon from the bowl to her mouth. When the empty bowls were taken away, Caroline turned toward Mr. Darcy. "How fortunate we are that you found the company at Meryton less than agreeable, Mr. Darcy, that you and Charles could grace us with your presence at dinner this evening." Mr. Darcy merely inclined his head in her direction. Undeterred, Caroline attempted once more to engage him. "I was most surprised earlier to receive Miss Bennet, when I had been expecting Miss Elizabeth. However, it appears one sister is more adequately adept in respectable methods of travel than the other. Does it not, Mr. Darcy? Thank goodness for your alteration of plan, or poor Miss Elizabeth might be lost to us forever." She gave Elizabeth a smug smile. "I cannot imagine any suitable reason for walking such a distance in fair weather, let alone a thunderstorm. How worried for your safety Miss Bennet and I were. Her humiliation must have been very great indeed to have made such an imprudent choice." Elizabeth stared at her in disbelief. She knew Caroline was supposed to be malicious, but sheesh. Her words were like honey laced with arsenic. As she watched her make Bambi eyes at Mr. Darcy, she fought the overwhelming desire to throat punch her. "I was very pleased to be of service to Miss Elizabeth Bennet, in any manner possible." Oh my gosh, sorry. Let me try that again. "I was very pleased to be of service to Miss Elizabeth Bennet in any manner possible," Mr. Darcy said, glancing fleetingly at her. "And I am most grateful for her safe recovery. The storm made travel of any form difficult. Certainly I felt the imprudence of leaving the inn, yet made the choice. The rain advanced so suddenly that no one could have properly planned for it." His eyes flicked toward her again, and she gave him a grateful smile. "I often find walking great distances refreshing, perhaps more so if it should happen to rain," he added. The corners of his mouth twitched upward momentarily as he continued to gaze at her. She smiled once more. "Now we're getting somewhere. Game on, Mr. Darcy." "I could not agree more, Darcy, old boy. It was truly a pleasure to escort Miss Elizabeth to my humble abode. Mr. Bingley grinned at her. "And of course we are beyond pleased that Miss Bennet could join us as well. The more the merrier, I say." He glanced at Jane. "It was quite dull with just the three of us for company. Miss Darcy can be terribly tiresome when he's in one of his moods. And my poor dear sister was beginning to find her feminine topics of conversation falling on deaf ears. I can only absorb so many different occasions to wear a bonnet, after all." Elizabeth met Jane's gaze, then looked away quickly while suppressing a laugh. The room was silent once more until the servants brought in the next course. Elizabeth gasped audibly as a large platter of what appeared to be the legs and curved talons of some type of animal was placed directly in front of her. Next to that, something that reminded her of an episode of The Office where Jim suspended Dwight's stapler inside a mountain of jello. Only in this case, the staplers were miniature lobsters with massive claws, jiggled frantically. Elizabeth swallowed hard as a wave of nausea came over her. She speared a clawed leg of meat with her fork and brought it closer to her face, turning it every which way to find the least repulsive end to eat first. Caroline, who had been watching her closely, cleared her throat and spoke again to Mr. Darcy. "Have you had any correspondence with your sister Georgiana recently, Mr. Darcy? I do so long to see her. She is such a perfect example of excellent manners and countenance, not to mention class. Characteristics quite lacking here in the country, I find." She turned her eyes toward Elizabeth, her mouth curving upward in a devious smile. Mr. Darcy broke the claws off his tiny lobster and looked up. "I received a letter from her this very morning. She is in excellent spirits, I thank you." Again his eyes met Elizabeth's, and his reassuring gaze gave her the courage to speak. "Are you enjoying your stay at Netherfield, Mr. Darcy?" "I am," he replied. "However, I must agree with Miss Bingley in regard to her disdain for the country. In general, I find I much prefer the swift pace of London." He stared at her for a few seconds before blinking several times and glancing around the room. Although one cannot argue the point that the country is far the superior in natural beauty. Elizabeth felt her cheeks blaze hot and wondered if he meant the landscape or something else entirely. She cast a glance at Jane and found her staring determinedly at her jello, her own cheeks bright pink. Wondering why her sister would be blushing, Elizabeth turned back to her claw. Her own cheeks were still burning, and she noticed her head was beginning to throb. She wondered if they would order a carriage to bring her and Jane home, or if they would stay the night. In reply, a roar of thunder shook the glasses, causing Elizabeth to jump. She gripped the table, her fingers accidentally touching Mr. Bingley's. She looked at him apologetically, and he smiled. "I believe you two ladies must stay for the evening. It seems that the storm has returned. I hope your mother will not be expecting you." "Oh, she's expecting something, all right." Elizabeth smiled at Jane, who giggled and immediately covered it with a small cough. She noticed Mr. Bingley's look of confusion and added, I don't think we will be missed, no." After a strange dessert, which Caroline had called blancmange, in an irritatingly I cannot do that. Blancmange, I don't know. Irritatingly flawless French accent, the ladies left the dining room. They headed to the drawing room where they waited for the men to join them after drinks. Elizabeth soon found herself unable to keep up with the flowing wit of Caroline Bingley, and thought longingly of the decanter of Madeira in the next room. Then her head began spinning, and her stomach felt as though it were in knots. She had just about made up her mind to tell Caroline to put a sock in it, when the men entered the room. She thought feebly about trying to place herself strategically near Mr. Darcy. Before she could muster the energy, however, Mr. Bingley sat in the chair closest to her. She was only half listening to him speak, her pulse beating a quick rhythm against her temples, when it registered that he said, "What would you think of a ball here at Netherfield in your honor, Miss Elizabeth?" She wrinkled her nose. I think I have a fever." Immediately, his smile vanished and was replaced with concern. He placed the back of his hand against her forehead and exclaimed, "You do. You are burning up." Jane overheard him and rushed over, placing her own hand on her head. "You must go to bed straight away," she cried, helping Elizabeth stand. "Of course," Mr. Bingley exclaimed as he jumped to his feet. "I will escort you to a room. Is there anything I can get for her?" "Perhaps some cold water and some rags? I will keep watch over her," Jane replied as they walked across the room. On the way out, Elizabeth glanced over her shoulder. Mr. Darcy appeared mildly concerned, but Caroline merely looked annoyed at the interruption of their card game. Neither said a word as they watched them exit into the hall. Mr. Bingley led them to a spare bedroom where he stood in the doorway, wringing his hands helplessly before leaving reluctantly to find a housemaid. Jane kept a watchful vigil over her sister the entire night, a night that seemed as though it might never end. Elizabeth fell in and out of a fevered sleep, her body aching and restless. Outside, the storm raged on with strong winds, rain, and deafening crashes of thunder that made Elizabeth's head pound and caused her to shiver uncontrollably. She was struck by the terrifying possibility that perhaps being sick in her subconscious meant that she was dying in reality. Every time she felt herself beginning to nod off, she fought it, forcing her eyelids open in fear that if she closed them, it might be for the last time. Jane was a faithful nurse, yet despite her best efforts, morning came and Elizabeth was much worse. Her fever was dangerously high. The room began to spin, and she had the distinct impression that she was either falling away from or toward an all-consuming light each time she closed her eyes. All of her senses seemed to be slowly diminishing. Even the dull ache in her head was subsiding. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear a muffled, high-pitched sound that gradually grew softer until the only thing she could hear in her ears was her own voice. "Why are you fighting this, Elizabeth? Just let go." A feeling of total serenity slowly washed over her entire body, as if she were sinking beneath the surface of a bathtub of lukewarm water. She was so very tired. Her brain insisted that she sleep. Yes, sleep sounds good. When she finally awoke with a start to see her sister's pale but relieved face, she sighed. Her body must be hanging on then, somewhere out in the real world. Even though she hadn't woken up from her unconscious state, a part of her was almost glad. She wasn't quite ready to return to a world where Mr. Darcy did not exist. Later that evening, Jane left to answer the many inquiries from Mr. Bingley as to how Elizabeth was feeling. When she returned and told her how concerned he was, she felt terrible, but also a little flattered. She wondered if Mr. Darcy was as worried. She spent a full hour fantasizing about him rushing into the room, seeing her lying there pale and feverish, and crying over her, begging her to fight for his sake. It made for a truly satisfying mental image. Though Mr. Darcy seemed indifferent to her illness, Mr. Bingley was very much distressed and offered to send for the physician from town. Jane thanked him, but thought it would be better to wait to hear her mother's opinion. A servant was dispatched to Longbourn to bring back clean clothes for the girls, as well as a report for her mother on her daughter. Far from being worried, Mrs. Bennet was thrilled that their stay had been extended. She was convinced that Elizabeth was perfectly safe. Determined that Jane should win Mr. Bingley's heart, and consequently his home and fortune, she was willing to allow one daughter to suffer just a little, for the assurance that the other would be allowed plenty of time in his presence. She promised to come the next day to check on Elizabeth, just as soon as the carriage was available. In the meantime, she felt certain that her second-born was in the best possible care. The next few days passed the same as the ones before, with Jane leaving her sister only to give the rest of the house updates on her condition. Then their mother came by carriage as promised, and although she found her to be much improved, proclaimed Elizabeth much too ill. to be removed from Netherfield for the foreseeable future. Mr. Bingley quite agreed. He was all too happy to have them both stay, as long as necessary. By late afternoon on the 4th full day of their stay, Elizabeth's fever had finally broken. She reluctantly obeyed her sister's commands not to leave her bed until while she went down to dinner with the rest of the household. When Jane returned, she told Elizabeth that she had talked with Mr. Bingley almost the entire evening. "Did Mr. Darcy say anything about me, Jane?" Elizabeth asked her sister hopefully. "Yes, he mentioned that he hopes you will recover quickly," Jane replied. Elizabeth rolled her eyes. Some hero. The next morning, Elizabeth was beginning to feel like herself again. The sun poured in through the windows like a good friend, warming her skin and lifting her spirits. Around midday, she got dressed, a feat that had been impossible for nearly a week. She left her room with Jane to take a short walk outside, but as the men were out hunting and Caroline had gone to town to pay a visit, they saw no one except a few servants. The exercise wore Elizabeth out fairly quickly, and she slept most of the afternoon. She awoke to the sound of gentle knocking on the door, and still groggy, called out, "Come in, Jane." The door opened slowly, and she was very surprised to see Mr. Bingley hesitantly peek into the room. I'm so sorry to disturb you, Miss Elizabeth. I was wondering, how are you feeling? I could not concentrate all morning for thinking of you. I bagged not a single bird." He paused. "Although I may or may not have grazed one of the footmen in the buttocks. There is no way of knowing from whose gun the bullet departed." Mr. Bingley gazed off thoughtfully, then shuddered. He flashed his dimples at Elizabeth. "Your sister informed me this morning at breakfast that you were greatly improved?" Elizabeth sat up quickly and subtly checked for signs of drool on her chin with the back of her hand. That would be me too. "I'm much better, thank you. I'm so sorry we have been here for so long. I promise we will be heading home very soon." "Oh, I would not dream of you leaving until you are completely recovered. With the exception of your being ill, of course. It has been a pleasure to have you here. You are certain you are recovering, then? That is to say, everyone has been greatly concerned for you." He gave her a bashful smile. "Really?" Elizabeth asked hopefully, thinking of Mr. Darcy. "Everyone?" "Of course," he replied quickly. "My sister has expressed her concern almost every moment. She sends her love and best wishes for your health." "I just bet she does. She probably wishes I would drop dead." "And Mr. Darcy? How is he doing?" she asked casually. "Oh, you know Darcy," Mr. Bingley smirked. "Ornery as ever, although he has been uncharacteristically cheerful in the evenings. A mystery I have yet to solve." "Right," Elizabeth replied, disappointed. She looked down at her hands and began picking at her cuticles. He gave her a tentative smile. "May I come in a moment?" Elizabeth hesitated. She couldn't remember. Was it against the rules back then for a man and a woman to be alone in the same room? Surely it was allowed if they were friends, right? He grinned at her, and she completely lost her train of thought. "Yes, please," she replied, smiling absent-mindedly. He walked in carrying a bouquet of wildflowers. "I wanted to give you these," he said with a bashful smile. Elizabeth sighed at the sight of the bright colors. She loved flowers. She remembered how Brian had brought her a bouquet of red roses every Friday when he picked her up at work. The amount, color, and type of flower never varied. It was always roses. It was always Friday evening, like clockwork. In fact, the only Friday evening he had forgotten to bring her roses was the night he told her he was in love with someone else. Compared to the bright, playful flowers that Mr. Bingley now held, those roses seemed stiff and formal, just like Brian. Pushing the memory of her ex-boyfriend to the back of her mind, she took the bouquet from his hands and, breathing in their sweet fragrance, said, "Thank you. They're so beautiful." "I have always loved wildflowers. I thought you might as well." He gazed at the flowers appreciatively. "May I place them in your pitcher? I will have another sent up right away with fresh water for you." After arranging them in the pitcher and standing back to admire the effect, he turned and hesitated before sitting at the end of the bed. Elizabeth smiled to herself. I'm pretty sure this is definitely against the rules." A moment of awkward silence passed, and she looked up at him. "Your home is so lovely. I would love to see more of it sometime." Mr. Bingley seemed to snap out of a reverie at the sound of her voice. "As soon as you are able, I would be honored to show you every nook and cranny of the old place." "I would love that," she replied excitedly. "Excellent. Then I will have something to look forward to," he said, and gave her a look that made her heart beat faster. She was suddenly very aware of just how alone they were, and was about to mention it when Jane came into the room. Upon seeing Mr. Bingley sitting on the bed, she stopped in her tracks and raised her eyebrows in surprise. Mr. Bingley jumped up quickly. "Miss Bennet, I brought Miss Elizabeth flowers for her bedside." He hurried past Jane to the door. "I will leave the two of you alone. I'm sure Miss Elizabeth will need to rest. However, if you are able, Miss Bennet, would you allow me to escort you to dinner this evening?" Jane looked at her sister, and seeing her nod emphatically, answered, "I would be honored." She gave him a skeptical smile. "Brilliant! I am so pleased to see Miss Elizabeth recovering so quickly. The credit must be entirely due to your exemplary nursing, Miss Bennet. How fortunate for her to have such a devoted and affectionate sister." He bowed before turning toward Elizabeth. "If there is anything at all I can do for either of you ladies, please do not hesitate to make it known. I am your humble servant." He gave her a wink and an endearingly crooked smile, then left the room. "So, dear sister of mine, what brought Mr. Bingley to your room?" Jane asked, smirking as she sat down next to her sister. Elizabeth, who had been subconsciously smiling at the closed door, looked back at her. He came to find you." "Is that right?" Jane asked, eyeing the flowers suspiciously. "Yes, he was asking me about your likes and dislikes." Elizabeth was careful to avoid eye contact. "I guess he wants to get to know you better." She could feel her face flush and hoped Jane didn't notice. Well, I believe you should get some rest now." Jane smiled. "You must be feverish again. You are beginning to babble incoherently." She stood up. "I am going to make myself ready to meet Mr. Bingley for dinner. I will have a maid bring you some soup and be back to help you prepare for bed." Bending down to kiss her sister on the forehead, she grinned. "Perhaps by that time, I will be able to give you a list of all of Mr. Bingley's likes and dislikes." On her way out the door, she smirked over her shoulder and added, "Oh, and by the by, if Mr. Bingley happens to visit you again, please be sure to tell him that while flowers are lovely, I much prefer chocolate." She winked. Elizabeth stuck her tongue out at her sister and pulled the covers up over her head. That night, another storm rolled in. The lightning and thunder made sleep next to impossible. When she finally managed to drift off, Elizabeth had a terrible nightmare. She dreamed that she was lying in a dark room. All around her, disembodied voices were whispering frantically as a dim, hazy light appeared. Blurry, undiscernible shapes moved slowly through it, and as one of them began to materialize into a person's face, she recognized it at once as Mr. Darcy's. He was leaning over her with his typical furrowed brow. He turned to speak to someone out of her line of vision, and she could just make out the words, "possible recovery," on his lips. His face suddenly disappeared, and the darkness returned, this time with the sound of a woman's muffled, heart-wrenching sobs. Elizabeth desperately shouted that she was all right, but no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't seem to make her voice heard. She closed her eyes in frustration, then opened them again to see Mr. Bingley's handsome face gazing down at her. His eyes were heavy with anguish. He started to speak, but his words were too soft for her to hear. Then his face crumpled as he began to cry. He looked absolutely grief-stricken as tears streamed from his blue eyes onto his cheeks. She inhaled sharply and felt a searing pain catch her breath in her chest as she watched him helplessly. She knew immediately that she would do anything to take away his pain, whatever might be causing it. The beating of her heart grew increasingly louder as she tried to reach for him, tried to call out his name. That's it. What's gonna happen next? Why is she having these nightmares? What could possibly be happening behind the scenes? I don't know. Anyway, we'll talk about it on Saturday. Pretty excited about it. Need to see you there. All right. Bye. See you next time.